Welcome to Immigration Insider with your host, attorney John Nicelli. This podcast is an educational forum on how to deal with complex aspects of immigration and pitfalls to avoid. You can find this show on all the major platforms, including YouTube, LinkedIn, Facebook, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and on our website, johnnicelli.com. Now here's the host of Immigration Insider, attorney John Nicelli.
Hi, everyone. This is John Nicelli. I'm an immigration lawyer in New York City, and I've been practicing immigration law exclusively for the last 43 years. Today, I'm going to speak about some stories of cases that I've won that are quite interesting and were quite difficult at the time. But I think it's good for people to know some of the things that can be done when you're in a really tough situation. So I had a Polish client come to me some years ago who was married to a U.S. citizen. And he had another lawyer. And when they went to see this lawyer, he told the lawyer that he had been arrested in Poland. He had been fighting in a bar, and he happened to be an amateur boxer at the time. And he got into this bar brawl. And 3 people ended up in the hospital. He was also injured, but he went home. He was able to get home, and his mom was a nurse, and his mom took care of him. Make a long story short, after the police interviewed the injured people that were in the hospital, they issued a warrant for his arrest, and he was subsequently arrested. After he was arrested, he went to trial on a case. He had pled innocent initially, went to trial, and he was convicted. After he was convicted, he was told that he had a report for sentencing, which was going to be, I guess, another week or a month later. And what he did is he somehow obtained a visa to come to the United States and left. So Poland didn't know where he was. So what they did is called Interpol and issued an Interpol warrant upon him. So basically what happened is when they told their lawyer that this whole story, they had been arrested in Poland, the lawyer said, no, don't mention anything about him being arrested in Poland, because it's not likely that immigration would ever find out, because they're going to check with the FBI, and the FBI usually only shows arrests that took place in the United States. So you shouldn't have any problem at all. So they filed the documents based on marriage to a U.S. citizen and him entering as a tourist, and they went to an interview. After the interview, the examiner asked him and asked the wife, have you ever been arrested? And they asked the wife, has your husband ever been arrested? And they both said, no, he's never been arrested anywhere. As far as I know, the wife said he's never been arrested. And the man said, no, I've never been arrested anywhere in the world. I'm a good guy. Says, I was an amateur boxer in Poland. I was very much into sports. So make a long story short, they said, okay, for today, I'm going to go over your file and I'll send you a decision in the mail. So the people left thinking everything was fine. So about a month later, they sent a decision. And the decision was to please come to reconduct the interview because they have additional information they wanted to ask about their marriage. So the two of them go back thinking everything is fine because they were married and living together. And the examiner says, I'm going to ask you again, have you ever been arrested? He says, no, I've never was arrested. So the examiner opens his file. He pulls out an Interpol warrant, shows him the warrant, says, sir, you're wanted in Poland. 5 minutes later, they had ICE officers waiting outside. They came in, they arrested him, and they put him in jail. That's when I got the case. So the wife came to me. She had been referred to another client who I had successfully helped in a different situation. And she came to me crying. She says, oh, my husband, we've been married some time already. He got married. This is what happened. We told the lawyer everything. The lawyer told us to lie. So we did. And he was in jail. So because there was an Interpol warrant, they didn't want to give him a bond. So the government says, ICE says, no bond. I went to the prosecutor, says, no, absolutely no bond. So I made a request to an immigration judge that we should have a bond hearing. Make a long story short, I was able to get him out on a bond, on a $10,000 bond, which is probably kind of low for the type of situation it was in, but the judge was reasonable, understood the situation. And at that point, it had already been about 5 or 6 years that he had been in the United States, maybe even more. So at that point, once he was released, they posted the bond, he was eventually released, and then we had a hearing before an immigration judge. When we had the hearing before the immigration judge, had a very, very, very tough and harsh prosecutor who was dead against this guy. No matter what he said, no matter what the wife said, she would interrupt the wife's testimony constantly. It was ridiculous. The hearing went on for probably about 7 or 8 hours because it was the entire day of testimony. And at the end of it, the judge denied the case. So I was pretty upset because I thought I had proved a pretty strong case regarding the hardship to the wife if he had been deported, because we had to file a waiver. So the judge didn't really care. She denied everything. To make a long story short, I filed an appeal. My argument in the appeal was, Judge, if you don't find that he's deserving of being granted adjustment of status, at least the hardship was very well documented, so at least the waiver should have been approved, if nothing else, and then he could always done visa processing abroad. And my argument was that, one of the arguments I made was that if the Polish government really wanted him, they had every opportunity to get him when he was detained. And then once I arrested him and informed the Polish authorities that they now had him based on an Interpol warrant, the Polish authorities never did anything. They didn't want him. So that was my argument. I said, well, he's maybe wanted, but they made no efforts to get him. Make a long story short, I won the appeal. He became a permanent resident, and it was a really, really good story. At the time, his wife was trying to have a baby, but she was so distressed over his situation that she couldn't conceive. And then after we won the appeal and things calmed down, a few months later, she was pregnant and they had a little girl. And thank God it was a great ending to a horrible story. I have another case I wanted to tell you about where another waiver, which was granted, which was another fraud waiver, okay, which is very, very interesting. So I had this man that came from I believe it was the Czech Republic. So he found some lawyer who eventually was arrested and lost his law license, who was doing fake papers. So he went to the lawyer and says, listen, I need to get my residence. Lawyer says, no problem, I'll do it. You don't need any papers. You don't need anything. So I believe he paid him about $10,000 to $15,000, possibly more. So after he paid him, the lawyer, the client knew really nothing about what was being done. All he knew is that he was going to get his residence. And that's all he really wanted to hear. So the lawyer filed all kinds of papers showing that he was a person of extraordinary ability. He gave a fake diploma. He gave a fake school transcript. He gave fake job letters saying this man was so extraordinary in whatever he did. And to make a long story short, he and his wife filed adjustment of status through this lawyer, and both obtained their residence based on these fraudulent documents. Subsequent to that, the lawyer was arrested, and then all the cases were put on notice that he was arrested. So what happened after that is his wife filed for citizenship. She files for citizenship. Despite the lawyer being arrested, she became a naturalized U.S. citizen. So after the wife became a citizen, the husband says, you know what? I'm going to try the same thing. If they did it for you, they can do it for me. So he files for citizenship. When he files, now immigration has all the information about the lawyer, and they related it to his file, which they should have done to the wife's as well, but they didn't. So they immediately put him in deportation proceedings. They didn't detain him, but they put him in deportation proceedings, actually removal proceedings. So he ended up going to see an immigration judge. When he went to see an immigration judge, I says, Judge, listen, he's married to a citizen who obtained a residence through fraud, actually. But he's still eligible for a fraud waiver. So unless the immigration authorities decide to denaturalize his wife, this man remains eligible for what they call a 237A1H fraud waiver. Then that waiver involves usually when a person commits some kind of fraud or misrepresentation in the efforts made to obtain his residence. In this case, they lied on his application. They lied when in his testimony, when he had an interview. It was just one big lie. And what happened is when I explained everything to the judge and the prosecutor, they agreed that I was right, and he was granted a fraud waiver, and he kept his permanent residence. So the wife is a citizen. He's still a resident. I don't believe they'll ever make him a citizen, but he is definitely a resident, and he will have no problem the rest of his life as long as he doesn't get into any trouble. So that was another very interesting case. So I have another one that I want to speak about, and this was a Brazilian client. And the Brazilian client was a young guy, about 30 years old, and he was a lawyer in Brazil. But he couldn't make enough money in Brazil, so he decided to come to the United States. So he comes to the United States, he files for a tourist visa. He had ties there because he was a lawyer. He had a house and family and whatever. And they gave him a tourist visa to come to the United States. So he came. So he comes to the United States, stays here 5, 6, 7 years, and then decides that he wanted to go visit Brazil for whatever reasons. He hadn't seen his parents and his grandparents for a while. And he also gets married to a U.S. citizen during this time. So he goes back to Brazil, but now his visa expired. He had no visa to come back. So he goes to the American embassy. He files for a visa, says, I'm a lawyer in Brazil. Basically the same story, that he was working in Brazil, which wasn't true. And they issued another visa to him. So he comes back as a tourist. After he comes back as a tourist, he files for adjustment of status through his wife. And based on that application, the case was going to be approved. But what happened, immigration checked out his visa, and they realized that they had been issued 2 visas. The first one, which he overstayed, and then the second one, which he also overstayed. So the immigration authorities told him, hey, listen, you can't adjust status. So they denied his case. And they said, you're going to need a waiver because you need a waiver for misrepresentation because you lied to the consulate and you had been unlawfully here. So he files a waiver because he was a lawyer. He thought he knew what he was doing, and the waiver was denied. So that's when he came to me. He says, listen, I'm in this real jam. This is what happened to me. He tells me the whole story. To make a long story short, we prepared a very, very, very lengthy and detailed waiver. It's probably over 1,000 pages in documents showing hardship to his American citizen wife. She had some medical issues. She also was trying to have a baby. She had problems conceiving. There was multiple other medical issues that she had. And she was also quite young. She was like 31, 32 years old. After about 3 years of waiting, finally, the appeal was granted. I won the waiver. We were able to get the adjustment of status application reopened, which had been denied, and he became a permanent resident. And I can't tell you how ecstatic that this man was. He was really, really, really happy. And I have one more story that I want to tell you, which is a short story. It's regarding a working visa. I had a man that came to me. He was from Poland, and he had a degree in chemical engineering. And during his career, he worked for over 20 years in the Polish penal system. He worked in different prisons. And his job in the prisons was basically he was in charge of fire control and fire extinguishers and everything related to fires and monitoring and safety and fires in Poland throughout many, many years. So when he came to me, he had this job offer from a company that makes swing sets. So I said, swing sets, okay. So I speak to the employer, and I said, I wanted to find out how interested he was in helping him. He says, no, I definitely like this guy. I want to help him, do whatever you could for him. And I says, but he's here as a tourist. It's going to be very difficult. The only way you can do anything for him, you have to first do what they call an H-1 visa, which is a professional working visa. So the employer says, listen, it's up to you. come up with something, and I'll discuss it with you. And if we're all in agreement, we'll file the case, and hopefully he'll be granted his work visa. So I did. So my dilemma was, well, how do I get a man that has a degree in chemical engineering, worked in the prison system based on with fire retardants and different things, and how is this man who makes swing sets going to possibly legalize this guy? It seemed to be totally unrelated. So what I was able to do and present to the employer, I says, listen, this man is a chemical engineer. One of the biggest problems you have with swing sets is the type you make are all made of wood. And one of the biggest problems is when you put them in the city parks is arson, because there's constant vandalism where at that time they would always burn the benches and the swing sets. So it was a big problem. Now, as a result, they make most of them out of metal and different types of fire retardant things. So what I told the employer, I says, listen, if he has a degree in chemical engineering, you could hire him as a person who's going to basically do research to make fire retardant substances, which can be used on your swing sets to prevent them from being burned and in different environments, especially the city parks. He says, that's one of the biggest problems we have, because he says, we put in a brand new swing set, it's all wood, and before you know it, 2 weeks later, the thing is burnt to the ground. It's all ashes. So he says, you know what? I can definitely do that. I definitely need him for that. Make a long story short, we filed the case based on that reasoning. The man was granted his H-1 visa for 3 years. During the time he had the H-1 visa, the employer agreed to sponsor him for permanent residence based on the same job description. And we were able to get him his green card. He became a permanent resident. He filed for his family and eventually became a U.S. citizen, as far as I know. So everything was good. It was kind of a unique situation, and I'm happy to say it was very successful. That's going to be all for today, because we're short on time today, and I wanted to thank you all for listening. And if we can ever help you in any immigration matter, as I said, we only do immigration for the last 33 years, going on 34. My number is 212-227-8020, and our email address is john@johnnicelli.com. Check my website. You can see our podcast. You can see a lot of information about immigration. And if anything, make an appointment, and we'll be happy to help. Thank you very much, and have a wonderful day.
You've been tuning into Immigration Insider with your host, attorney John Nicelli. You can find this show on all the major platforms, including YouTube, LinkedIn, Facebook, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and on our website, johnnicelli.com. Thank you for your positive reviews, comments, questions, and for sharing this show with others.